This morning, the Veterans History Project at the Fairhope Public Library is interviewing Elizabeth Sheffield Byars, who was born in Jackson, Mississippi in the year of 1926, and who was raised in Calhoun City, Mississippi. Elizabeth is here today to tell us about what it was like to be on the home front as a young girl and then a young woman during the Second World War. And Elizabeth, would you tell us a little something about your family life prior to the war and then as the war began?
I grew up, although born in Jackson, I grew up in that small town and had a small town life. I had a mother and a father and one brother. My father was a printer. He came from Jackson to Calhoun City because his good old buddies, the Murphy brothers, were in need of his services then, and we stayed in Calhoun City for the rest of the time. I stayed with my parents until I got married and moved away. It was kind of a tough time. North Mississippi was still in depression. Well, of course, all through the 30s were depression years, and people had to learn to do without, make do, repair it, use it up, or whatever. So that kind of helped us with the days of the rationing. But it was a good life. We had a lot of relatives around, and there was very little to do after I got older in a small town. We had the movies to go to and the ball games at the school and things at church and things like that. That was our life. My father came home for what was called dinner then in the middle of the day, and he usually ate well, took a little nap, and went back to work. So it was a pretty good life, really.
Can you remember where you were and what you were doing on the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked?
I can. I was 15 years old. This is not going to be a wartime love story on my part. I was 15 years old and a junior in high school, and that Sunday I think I was riding around in the car with some of the girls, and the radio started telling us about the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor. Where's Pearl Harbor? Well, it's in Hawaii. They sunk all the ships in Hawaii, and it was really a kind of a time of excitement, although, bad excitement. But the next day, I think it was kind of a warm, sunny day for December then, but the next day the whole school assembled in the auditorium to hear President Roosevelt's speech, about the Day of Infamy and the declaration of war. Up until that time, we had all been aware of the war in Europe and paying some attention to it. We heard Edward R. Murrow on the radio and describing the bombing in Britain, and we were interested in it, but my father was one of those people who was very opposed to the U.S. sending troops to Europe. He was in World War I, and he said never again should we send troops to Europe. But then after we were attacked, that became a different thing then, and he kind of backed off. He was ready for us to start doing something about it. Selective service had started before that. I think it probably started in 1940, and a lot of the young men in town had registered, for selective service, and there was a lot of talk about who had a high draft number and who had a low draft number, and their chances of getting hired to go to work after they got out of school. If they had I think it was a low number were the ones that went first. Then my father was appointed to the draft board. This was very difficult for him because he knew that a lot of those men he was sending down there were not going to come home. But he did his job faithfully, even got a commendation for doing it. But it was not an easy time for him.
Did the atmosphere in your town change that week following Pearl Harbor?
Well, it did some. It changed more later in the year, or in 1942, after they Army built Camp McCain as a training camp for soldiers. A lot of the people from our town went over there to help with the building of it, so it gave them jobs. Finally, farmers were getting good prices for their crops, and things were looking up. People had a little more money to spend, and it got very bustling around, which was exciting and gave us all a bit of enthusiasm, even though we were learning of the horrors of the war. We had been going to movies, and every movie began with a newsreel. And the newsreel was showing a lot of the fighting in Europe, and especially in London and everything. So we were, pretty well aware of it, but suddenly it came home to us. We were going to have to do something. Little factories got started. There was a small factory in Calhoun City where they made parts for aircraft, landing gear, I think it was. People went to work there. Jobs were more plentiful, especially after the young men had to go to war, and that left some openings for things too. And even after Camp McCain was built, many people went over there to work at different jobs. I mean, I think were secretaries or whatever, and the men worked at other service jobs type things. It was, there was a difference, definitely.
I understand that the Camp McCain was named after a rather illustrious family from...
Well, John McCain, I think it was his grandmother lived in someplace, the Carrollton, I think it was, Mississippi, and I think he was there in the summertime, but the camp was named for an uncle of his who was maybe a lieutenant colonel or a colonel or something in the Army. I don't know for sure, but it wasn't named for John. He was a little young for that. He didn't come along till the Vietnam War.
Well, Elizabeth, tell me, when did rationing start in that time?
I think rationing started in 1942. I have a little note here. It started probably in that summer, but gasoline was already rationed, I believe. It was tough. Gasoline was rationed. People had A stickers or B stickers or C stickers, as I remember it. The A sticker was for ordinary people. You didn't get much gasoline with an A sticker, and the B's got some more. The C stickers were mostly for doctors and people who had essential driving type jobs, because our doctors had to travel all over the county, And then farmers could get gasoline. They had to have it. They had to keep their machines going and everything, because the farming was considered a very essential part of the war effort, really. But when rationing started, everybody got a coupon book. We had meat was rationed, butter was rationed, sugar was rationed, oils, fats, things like that. Shoes were rationed. This was particularly hard on people who had small children or young growing children, because they needed more than 2 pairs of shoes a year, which was all you could get. But as I said, people were kind of accustomed to making do, and we made do. I don't remember exactly if people used honey when they could get it for sugar, and they made a syrup from sugar cane, and we used that. So we made do. A lot of the time I was away at school, and I did not miss the meat because the school was able to have meat. We had to take our ration books to school with us. If you needed a pair of shoes, you had to go to the controller's office and get your shoe coupon. And then we could take it home, like for Christmas holidays, and our parents could get, coffee was rationed. I did not drink coffee at that time, and my mother was delighted to have me come home with my coffee coupon, because she did drink coffee.
So everybody in the family then got a ration book, did they?
That's my memory of it, that they did. Even the small children, because they had to have shoes, or maybe only parents could get shoes for the children. I don't know. It was pretty tough. We didn't have small children in my family. My brother, my only sibling, was younger than I, but he was already, in his teens, I guess it was. Let's see, if I was 18, he was 14, something like that. No, I wasn't 18. I was 15. He
15,
was young.
that's right.
He was probably 11 or 12.
Mm.
But, anyway, it was. It got to be kind of exciting around town that first year after Camp McCain began to train young men. They didn't have anything to do, and they came to Calhoun City. It was a town that was built around a square, and the square would just be flooded with khaki on the weekends. and they didn't have very much to do, you know. It was the movies to go to, and I will say Mississippi was dry, more or less, at that time, and so you couldn't buy alcohol in Mississippi, or in North Mississippi, in that county. So there were no bars and no saloons for them, and they just kind of hung around the square in the cafes, and it was almost overwhelming if you were a girl trying to get around.
Oh, I can imagine, yeah.
Especially a young girl. But we had no USO.
Ah.
But my mother was, she was president of the American Legion Auxiliary, I think, at that time, and she and some of the ladies worked with some of the people at Camp McCain to arrange dances when they could find girls to come to, you know, and we had dances at the American Legion hut, I think it was, and I was allowed to go because Mother was there. Those young men did love to dance, some of them, even if they didn't have enough girls to go around. That's where I learned to jitterbug. But it was pretty different to the way it had been the years before the war, at any rate. But I went away to school then in the fall of '43. I graduated from high school and went away to school, and was not in the town that much except at summertime. And I always had a summertime job. Some of my friends worked over at Camp McCain during the summer. I worked for a lawyer there at home. Some of my friends worked in that factory that had started up there, making airplane parts.
Mm.
And but it was kind of interesting. Some of the young women who went to those dances married some young man that they met at the dance from Camp McCain. Some of those men came back after the war and married girls that they had met when they were coming over for their training, during their training periods and everything. But I went away to school. The biggest difficulty was getting there. Parents didn't have automobiles, or if they did, they didn't have gas. I'll tell you a funny story about my father. He had just ordered a new set of tires for the car just before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He said, well, I guess I won't get my tires. But they had been put on the delivery truck just that week, and he got his new tires. And sometime later, he was going in the men's club, which is the barber shop or the service station or whatever. Oh, what good was a car? You know, you can't buy gasoline, you can't get tires, you can't do this and that. I just ought to sell the darn thing. I don't know whether he said darn or not. But this man spoke up and says, well, what do you want for that car? It was not a new car. You know, you could not buy new cars during the war. Detroit was making military vehicles, not automobiles. And he said some amount, I don't remember what it was, that he thought was an exorbitant amount, and this man started peeling off the dollars, bought the car right then and there. He was the local bootlegger, and he needed the tires.
Oh.
But anyway, this upset Mother no end, because all of a sudden we don't have a car and we can't get another one. I was just learning to drive. It kind of upset me, too. But so we didn't get a car until after the war. They didn't by that time. I think it was in '46 they started making new cars again. And my husband-to-be, his father got one of the first ones that was sold in Calhoun City. And he was very generous in letting Frank have it so we could go on dates to different places and things like that.
Elizabeth, I'd like to go back to Camp McCain for just a minute again. I understand that in the state of Mississippi, during the war, especially towards like 43, 44, 45, that quite a few German and some Italian war prisoners came into the camps in Mississippi. And the majority, the prisoners of war came into camps that were American military camps. And that Camp McCain and also down in Clinton, Camp Clinton, they had the elite African Corps. Rommel's African Corps prisoners were there. Did you ever interface, or your family or your friends, with any of them, or did you hear stories about them being there? Can you recall anything like that?
I really didn't hear about anyone having any sort of relationship with any of them, friendship or anything like that. I did hear from time to time that they were there, but I never knew anything about them. Whether some of the people in Calhoun City did, or whether they came on a work detail to Calhoun, they may have gone into maybe picking cotton was a big thing. The farmers in Calhoun County did not have those big mechanical cotton pickers. And right after the war was started, that last year that I was in high school, the schools delayed opening. We usually opened, the 1st of September,
Mm-hmm.
They delayed opening until October so that the students could go pick cotton. I didn't do that. Mother told me I could not pick cotton. You would burn your skin up, and besides, cotton picking is hard work. Dragging those long cotton sacks along, and you were paid at that time according to how many pounds you picked, and picking a pound of cotton is not an easy task. Not that I have ever done it. As I said, Mother wouldn't let me. She always was particular about keeping my skin fresh. But I did hear, that just a little bit about the prisoners, but I was not there. After that first fall, I was not there. In '43, I was gone to school, and so I don't know very much about that.
Was there a different feeling in the town that you went to college in about the war, or did it seem to be similar to what you had at home at Calhoun City?
I must say that my college, Mississippi State College for Women, only had women students. Therefore, there was an air base in Columbus where this college was located, but we didn't have a great deal of how will I say, the only thing we had was deprivation, well, for one thing, of hose. I didn't say silk hose and nylon hose were not to be had anywhere. My roommate had the only pair of nylon hose that I knew of in our dormitory, and maybe in the whole school. And she would launder them very carefully and put them in a glass jar and seal it up between times she wore them. But for the most part, the main thing was just we had to go along with the rationing and so on. The college girls didn't have too much to do with the citizens of the town. We were on campus, and of course we went to town, to the movies and to buy things and things like that. We were, the first 2 years that I was there, we were required to wear navy blue or white clothes. So the townspeople always knew us when we were in town. We also were not allowed to go to town by ourselves. We had to go in groups, which was fine. Girls like to go in groups anyway. There had to be at least 4 of us to go to the movies or whatever. But I can't say that we did have too much interaction between us and the townspeople. We had difficulties getting home sometimes, but as I said, because there was no parental ability to come and pick us up or anything, so we had to take the train or take the bus. There were some girls who could take the train home, but for the most part, we had to go by bus. This got to be a difficult thing to leave my town and get back to school, and I was required to be supposed to be in by midnight, You had to take a bus from Calhoun City over unpaved road, part of it, to where you could change to a bus that was on the main highway, east-west highway, from the Delta, Greenville, the Delta to Columbus over at the other side of the state. And many times we would get there to that bus station in that town and couldn't get on the bus. Buses would go through and they were crowded, they were full. There was a junior college and then Mississippi State College, which was for men, and they had an Air Force training thing there. And then there was MSCW, and there was the Columbus Air Base, and then the buses went on to Tuscaloosa, the University of Alabama. So it was full, always. They would be full, and finally the driver would come by, and he'd see our navy blue and white, and he knew we were supposed to be in the dormitory that night, and he would let us get on board. If you were fortunate, you'd find somebody that you knew who would share her seat with you. Otherwise, you sat on your suitcase in the aisle of the bus, and there were a lot of young men in uniform on there as well as the girls. And sometimes it was pretty jolly. We sang and we told jokes and compared backgrounds, so to speak. But it was a difficult thing. At the days that I was at the W, we had Saturday classes, so we didn't get to go home all that often. Just, we had only so many cuts that we were allowed for a class. And so we mostly just went home for holidays, and then the difficulty in getting back, you know.
Did the school have any programs there where you volunteered to do things for the service people, and where you maybe sent gift packages and?
Well, I think the main thing we did was we had dances that these young men could attend. You know, we didn't have men on campus, and so it was delightful for the girls to have those men come. But these were very fleeting friendships. You know, you met them and you never saw them again. There were some of my friends who lost loved ones in the war. My roommate, her fiance came home with just one leg. So there was always the reminder of the war. And of course, in 1945, well, one thing, we all listened to the radio and we watched the newsreels. We knew a lot of places in France and Italy and Germany and those places like that. But when it came to all those places in the South Pacific and the Central Pacific, the Marianas, the Solomons, Guadalcanal, Okinawa, all of those places, we had to go get our atlases and look them up to see where they were, because we tried to keep up with what was going on. And then in 1945, President Roosevelt died, and I can remember we sat around in the dormitory wondering what is going to happen now, because nobody knew anything about then Vice President Truman, and so it was a time of a little bit of fear and wondering, is the war going to keep on going forever? And shortly after that came Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and suddenly it was all over. The young men were coming home. I didn't have to decide what service I'm going into when I graduate from college. I could go on planning for the rest of my life, and it was such a feeling of relief after that. My husband-to-be was discharged maybe in January, early in 1946, and that was my junior year in college. But when I came home that summer, his parents while he was in service, his parents had moved in just down the street from my parents, so we met. I have to tell you about that summer. It was absolutely wonderful. All the young men were coming home. The GI Bill had made it possible for some to go to school, some to start their own businesses, to buy houses, you know, to get married, to start families. It was just a lovely summer as far as I was concerned. I didn't have anybody close to me who had been killed in the war. There were some in town, I don't think I mentioned it. Mothers hung little banners in their windows that were red and white and blue with a blue star in the center of it. And if you passed by a window and there was a gold star in the center, that meant that her loved one had been killed. So, you know, we did have that feeling, but in the summer of '46, those who were still alive were back, and it was just great. The government, I don't know if it's part of the GI Bill, they had set up a plan where these young men could collect $20 a week unemployment pay for 52 weeks while they were searching for jobs. They called it, the guys all called it 52-20 Club. Well, the man who was dispensing those $20 bills came to our town, stood under a shade tree with a clipboard and checked off the men and handed them $20 bills. They called it shade tree money. So he gave them their $20 on Thursday, and we had a party on Friday. We had a lot of good times with barbecues and chicken fries and fish fries and things like that, usually at a state park nearby. It was just a wonderful summer. And by the end of the summer, Frank and I knew we were going to get married. We had attended all those parties together. I went back to school to finish my senior year, and he went to Mississippi State to get started with his freshman year. It wasn't easy because he had been out of school for 4 years. But Uncle Sam paid all this tuition, bought all the books and supplies that he needed, and I think I've forgotten how much the original payment was. We got married the next summer and lived at Mississippi State for the next 3 years in the married students' housing. And I think he got $90 a month, and it didn't cost us very much to live in the married students' housing, but we made it just fine. He had, when he was in service, been a fire controlman. The Navy sent him to school to learn about gyroscopes and stable elements. Now, I know what a gyroscope is, but I'm still not sure what a stable element is, except that it helps keep the guns level when they're shooting on board ship. And he was stationed in San Diego at the destroyer base there, and his job was to repair and maintain the guns on the ships when they came in to have work done on them. Some of them, there to start with, it was pretty desperate. They had gotten shot up pretty badly. He didn't just work on destroyers, he also did other vessels too that came in there. There was not much left. He said when he got out there to the West Coast, people were frightened. They knew the Japanese, this was in '42, they just knew the Japanese were going to land any day, and they had no weapon, no defenses. People didn't have guns then the way they have now, and they were very frightened. This was about the time, I think, when they interned all the Japanese, that lived in California. It was kind of a bad thing the U.S. did, but they thought they were rounding up any spies that might be there. I don't know that any of them were spies, but, how do I know? But anyway, he had worked while he was doing this repair work with GE engineers who were just beginning to get computer-assisted fire controls for the guns. And he said when he got out of the Navy, he was going to school. He was going to be an engineer, and he was going to work for General Electric Company. He was so impressed with them. Well, he did go to school, and he graduated with a BS in electrical engineering and went to work for GE. That was his ambition achieved. It was such a good time to have no worry about people getting shot and killed at that time. Right after the war, I don't think that we probably still had troops stationed in Germany, and of course we still had some in Japan, or had those ships in Japan in the harbor there. But it was so nice to not have to worry about people going into battle all the time. It was just a wonderful time in my life.
Elizabeth, did your city, Calhoun City, change very much after the war as before the war?
Yes, it did. As I said, people had more money, and they could start new businesses, so it grew. It was a very small town. It may be called Calhoun City, but it was a very small town, maybe 3,000 people, 2,000 maybe at the most. But these young men who had been away had seen more of the world, and they had been associated with different people from, different backgrounds. And some of those young men who came back there to live were from Boston or New York City or whatever, and they had quite a different background to the girls that they had left behind. But they all made it fine, I guess, as far as I know.
So, and your family, do you have much family left in Calhoun City now?
I have one cousin who's 92 years old now, and she had 6 children, and 3 of them still live there, and their children, well, of course, her children are grown, her grandchildren are grown, she now has great-grandchildren, but some of them are still there, and I still go back. My very dearest friend died last spring. I would go back to see her, and I miss going back to see her, but I kept in touch. Both our mothers still lived in that town for a long time, even though we never did. And, of course, we always went home to visit them, at least once a year. We lived a long way away sometimes. It was difficult to get there more than about once a year. But we kept in touch with people there. But the town it has changed more now because there's not much left. The businesses have closed, young people have gone away, and it isn't a place that I would want to go and stay. I shouldn't say that. They'll hate me for saying that.
Oh, no, that's perfectly all right.
My
Well,
cousin who lives there thinks it's great.
did you, I just want to go back for a minute, did you ever have any blackout curtains and things in your home and in businesses where you live so that airplanes, if any foreign airplanes were flying over, they wouldn't see the light in the house?
I don't think we did very much of that. As I said, I didn't live there during a good part of the war. I wasn't there. But I don't know why any airplanes would have been flying over there except for Camp McCain. And it's a long way from any ocean to Calhoun City. The closest one would have been the Gulf Coast, and that's still 300 miles away, or no, it's more than that, I guess, 300 miles away. So any planes flying over would probably have found a target long before they got to Calhoun City. So I don't think people were very worried about leaving. Well, maybe we turned out the lights, and it wasn't exactly a total blackout or anything that I remember anyway. When I first got to school, I remember we had an air raid drill and turned off all the lights and sat in the hallway in the dormitory and sang, as one does. But I don't remember that lasting very long. I think they thought the target might be the Columbus Air Base, but as far as I know, no planes ever penetrated that far.
Elizabeth, you mentioned that it was a difficult life with the Depression prior to the war coming for the people in the area. So being deprived of things during the war probably wasn't quite as bad there than it might have been in some places. It was more affluent.
I think that's true. It was not that we had plenty. I don't mean that we were desperate or anything like that. There were no people that starving or anything like that. Everybody had plenty to eat because everybody had gardens. And my father was a hunter and fisher, and so the family had meat. It might not have been beef or pork, but there was a lot of pork grown out there too. But no, it was we were poor, but we didn't know we were poor. We still had plenty to eat, clothes to wear, friends to socialize with, and everything. It was not a bad life.
So your reflections now during the Second World War, do they vary from reflections that you might have from the Korean War and the Vietnam War? Did you have any friends or friends' children who were involved in any of these wars?
Well, my brother, who was younger than I, went into the service, into the Air Force during the Korean War, but he was never sent overseas, so not to Korea, to fight. So I didn't have anybody else. Frank had a younger brother. Yeah, he was in the Navy during the Korean War, I believe. Served on an aircraft carrier, but none of them were, involved in all that desperate fighting on the Korean Peninsula. As a matter of fact, Frank went to work for GE after he graduated in 1950, and just about the time he was told to report to Schenectady in New York, a big change for me, I'll tell you. And about the time we arrived in Schenectady, the Korean War started. And Frank and I both worked with GE, and he was working on some kind of controls for submarines, I think it was. And the group that I worked for did various things with aircraft. So we knew, we were there, we knew about it and all that, but we didn't have anybody who was actively in there. Now my son's wife, her father, I didn't know this is much later, but her father was a CB, I think during the Korean War. And he was involved in building airstrips and things like that. But other than that, we didn't have any direct connection. When we got to Schenectady, this was just after a lot of the spy scare that they had had. I can't remember that man's name. I was a spy for 3 different organizations. I think he was a spy for some of the enemy and a spy for other companies. I don't remember now what it was, but we all had to have security badges, and you did not go in certain places without a certain kind of a badge in the factory. General Electric had a huge factory in Schenectady at that time, probably still do. I guess there were maybe 300 buildings, separate buildings, and it was a huge place. And they were building a lot of different things then. But it was, you were checked on your security. I had to have a badge. I had to be able to open the safe files. And so I had to be very careful what kind of badge. I remember being fearful enough when I got on the bus to go home, I would hide my badge so nobody could see what kind of security I had. But it was, as far as the Vietnam War was concerned, the most thing I can remember about that is the desperate protests that were made. Friends I had who wanted their sons to go to Canada so they wouldn't be drafted. It was an altogether different atmosphere and different time to what it was in World War II. When we went to World War II, everybody went to war. No exceptions. Even those who stayed on and worked in factories and worked around on the home front, we were all at war. But in the Vietnam War, we never were. I don't know, that whole idea of guns and butter was just, it just was not the same. If you're at war, you're at war. It's about the same way now, I think. If we're at war, we're at war. And of course, during World War II, we all had all these things about loose lips, sink ships, and keeping your mouth closed. Don't tell where your loved ones' letters are coming from. Of course, there was censorship during the war. Some people would get letters that you could hardly read because most of it was blacked out. But the soldiers and sailors knew, to be careful about what they said to their home folks, because home folks didn't realize the seriousness of espionage and spies and so on. I don't know that there was much of that in Calhoun City because it's such a small place. I can't say about that, but we all were very careful to pay attention to what we were talking about, especially if you had just been with some of the servicemen,
Well, Elizabeth, it has been absolutely wonderful. I have mental pictures of just about everything that you have said, and really to know about the home front, especially during World War II, and then your observations and your experiences through the Korean War, your thoughts in the Vietnam War. And I thank you so very much for coming here today and being a part of this wonderful program.
I feel flattered that you had me here, and I hope it will be of some interest to somebody someday, that even young girls can get involved in these things. We did I didn't mention that, we did search for scrap iron, do the bundles for Britain, all those sorts of things. I myself was not a knitter, I did not knit any socks for anybody. But it was a time in my life that was quite different to what I had been experiencing up until then. And then it was different to what I later experienced. My husband and I were married for 55 years. We lived in various places with GE, and I got to see a lot of the United States, especially, that I probably would not have seen had I stayed in Calhoun City. But it was good years that we had. We had one son. We still have one son. And we have no grandchildren, though. So I kind of envy my cousin who has the 6 children and all the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, which she keeps sending me pictures of on Facebook or whatever.
Oh, well, that's lovely. Well, thank you so very much.
Well, thank you for
Really
having me.
appreciate
I
it.
hope it has
Thank
been
you.
something that has been
Oh, it's wonderful.
interesting. Will be
Yes.
interesting to somebody else.